So I want to wrap up the example I gave last time. There's one critical piece that I didn't quite get to at the end, so we'll do that, and then we'll talk about streaming video and kind of how a browser works. That's the two things that were mentioned. I'll give you a heads up for how a browser works. I started looking into it and studying the details of how browsers work, and I don't know, I just find it so boring, so I kind of stopped. But I'll give you like a high-level overview and my understanding of how a browser works. I don't know, something about it just isn't interesting to me. If it's interesting to you, take Alan's 370, because he does find it interesting. And I like that class exists because I can just hand it off to him without feeling pressure to understand everything in the world. It's a great relief. Okay, so last time we went into the debugger. We saw how this, let me get somewhere here. We were going into the debugger to see where we get our TCP stuff. And we got to a certain point here where we're actually looking at sockets. Let me just get back there. Let me skip over some things. Getting the port, setting some values. That I think we skip. This we can skip. This we go into. Did I miss it? No, here we go. Oh, and I set a breakpoint right there. And we finally get into where we're creating the socket. This is where the TCP socket is actually created, or the socket server is actually created. So we're happy. Once we get here, we're feeling good about our reports. We got to the juicy bits, and then that whole path to get down here from our code, that's what we would be putting in our trace for our reports in the magic section. Yeah.
So, what would you explain this? Like, when you go through every single level, you go through and explain what call it?
Didn't you ask that same question last time? I already answered that. Just like a sentence or two of each hop. Like, this is where this method is called. Like, some of those steps, like, there's not much to say. Like, this method is called from this library. But where there's some juicy bits happening, like where we're handing off between libraries, I want, at least a few sentences there. This is where Flask is handing off to WorkZeog. Would be nice to have that as the explanation. Enough explanation where I'm convinced you have at least an idea of what's going on in this library would be my final answer on that one. You don't need to understand every line of code by any means. You don't need to fully internalize, like, you don't need to get to the level where you could contribute to this project, to this repo, for example. Like, you don't need that level of understanding. I'm not demanding that much. But you should have some understanding that there are methods here being called by other methods, and you have this chain, this call chain, which is finally getting to your code, or the other way around. Your code calls this method, which calls this method, which calls this method, goes all the way down the chain, goes through multiple libraries. This goes through, for example, this goes through Flask. Can't quite get there. This goes through Flask. So this is our code. This is Flask code. This is WorkZeog code. So we have 3 different code bases already. And then when we get to the next call here, no, it didn't quite get in there. But when we get into that next step, we're going to be in Python code. And by the time you get to Python code, you don't have to go into the internals of Python. Because that's something you are allowed to use on your homework, you can stop at that point where we're actually creating the server. But what I want to show is this line right here, 989, and the steps down the call stack. You need to provide links to this code in your reports. And this is the last part that I wanted to talk about, that I didn't get a chance to talk about last time. So we're in serving.py of the workzeug library. So I need to find a link to that code, which can be different for each library. I'm going to try workzeug. I really got to learn how to pronounce that. I missed the Z, actually. And then GitHub. Workzeug? I think it's like Workzeug, right? It looks German. Workzeug? Yeah. I'm good with that. Workzeug? I'll start pronouncing it like that. But I just typed the name of the library followed by GitHub. It took me right to their GitHub page. Most of this code is open source. Clearly, I had the source all in my IntelliJ, or in my PyCharm, I mean. I'm always going to make that mistake, ain't I? It's in my PyCharm. Like, I could see all the source code, right? It's got to be open source. How did I get that source code? Just pip install. That gave me all the source code. So, and everybody uses GitHub these days. So I found it on GitHub. Let me look at where we are. Looks like the root directory, and then serving.py, line 989. So I want to go to the root directory, serving, scroll all the way down, and of course it's a different version. So what I'm looking at here is a different version than what I'm looking at in PyCharm. No problem. I'm just going to copy, find, paste. That's not the right one. It does take a little searching. Maybe that was the right one. There's only one. It would have to be that one. Get socket address, server address, cast exists, server.bind. I mean, this is all the right stuff. Am I going to get too many results if I just look for socket? Oh, socket server, what are you doing here? Yeah, socket server is not being used directly. The socket, what about socket dot? So I might not go the whole way here. Interface API. I mean, that's got to be it. Anyway, so this may or may not be. Question?
What do you do if you're using a framework that provides functionality for two separate things for on the different portions of the like class covers?
Then you have two reports that talk about the same library. That would be the exact thing here. Yeah. Yeah. Why would you do anything else? And that's what we did on Wednesday. I went through two examples, pretty much went through two reports, not all the way, not everything, but with the same framework. So maybe this might not be exactly what we want, but I'm not going to go the whole way. But I do want to show you the point that I'm trying to make here, is when you add the links to your report, click the line number on GitHub, get the permalink, and then paste that into your reports. Those are the links we want to see. At a specific line number, please do not copy the entire URL for this code with 1,000+ lines and say, it's somewhere in here. Like, that's not a good report. That's going to get some points off. It's somewhere in here doesn't show us that you actually looked through this code and saw where the socket is being opened. But if you give us a line number, I'll paste that link. That takes us right to the line. You say, this is the line that's opening a socket server. Then we know that you actually look through this stuff and you know what's going on. That isn't the line, I don't believe. But it should be listen. Listen queue. Well, anyway, I'm not going to keep going through it. Connect, maybe? But it's better off that I don't find it, because then that leaves some work for you to do. But that's the idea. That's what I expect. Your reports need to go to that level of depth. You need to go through these libraries, actually crack these libraries open, and look through the code of these libraries to figure out where the good bits are, and then show me how, bridge the gap between your code and the good bits that look like homework code, where headers are being parsed. And sometimes you can shortcut this. If I'm in, like I know WorkZug is parsing my headers too, or I'm guessing anyway. I don't know for sure. But if I search for /r/n, oops. Like, I can get closer to the stuff that's relevant to me by doing a search in the library for the things that I know have to be in there. Somewhere in this library, whatever library is parsing your headers, they need to have a /r/n. Like, it has to be there. Look, this looks like multi-part. No, it's even called multi-part. This looks like multi-part parsing code. Takes me right there if I just utilize a search feature. A lot of good bits going on in here. Yeah.
But you're supposed to do the actual, entire trace, correct? So you can have,
Yeah, this just narrows down your search. That's not your final answer. But, if I find the code, if somewhere in here I find the code that's doing parser heading, or header parsing, breakpoint, run your server, send it a request. It's going to give you your whole trace. If you're smart about how you do this, it's not too much work. It's still a bit of work, don't get me wrong. Sometimes doing the reports can be more work than the actual project itself. Students are always surprised when they find that out. It might be more work than the project itself. But if you use these tips, if you follow what I've done this lecture on Wednesday, it won't be a tremendous amount of time. It won't be too bad. Especially when you're doing your WebSocket parsing. I didn't talk about the WebSocket stuff at all, but just go up to your top-level library where all of your dependencies are and search for that global unique ID. You know for a fact that ID that we use for WebSockets to compute the accept, that has to be in the library that you're using. So you just go up here, search for that globally unique ID, look for where it's being used, plop a breakpoint right there. You're halfway home already. But if you don't use a debugger, I would say, without a debugger, it's probably more work doing the reports than actually writing the code. Which, by the way, one of the traps that I always see in this class, somebody who's really, usually a good developer and everything, will take the project and just run with it. And then their teammates will be sitting there, waiting for something to do. Or the worst case is actually, a group of 5, 4 of you are pretty decent developers and everything. You kind of run away and leave that 5th member behind. And then you get towards the end of the semester and you all look at each other and say, well, 5th member, you haven't really done anything. You just handle the reports. Those reports are going to be really crappy because you dumped a ton of work on a single group member. That's going to crush them already. And if they're the one who got left behind during the coding, they're not going to be able to write the reports either. Don't fall in that trap. I hate having a really good project and I have to give them close to a 0 on the overall score for their project because they just dumped one. Usually they're Least competent, what's the softest way to word that? Like least competent group member got stuck with all of the reports and just couldn't handle that task because it's a pretty big task. It's a big task. So don't fall in that trap. Don't underestimate the reports. But if you listen to my advice, I don't think it's that hard to do the reports. Oh, one more thing. I actually do have to talk about something else with the reports. We have the project report checkpoint coming up. And I'm getting a few questions about this. There's no grade attached to this checkpoint. This is not when reports are due. So I just want to make sure that's cleared up. I said it in lecture, so now nobody should ask me that question again. If they do, I'll say, where were you during lecture? But the checkpoint, no grade attached to this. After this checkpoint, the TAs are going to go into your repos, look at your reports, and then give you feedback on your reports. So what I recommend is getting at least one of the 3 reports done before this checkpoint, and then you can get that feedback from the TAs to let you know if you're doing what we expect from the reports. So there are lots of questions, lots of good, valid questions about reports. The idea of this checkpoint is do what you think I mean for reports, and then after this checkpoint, get the feedback from the TA, and if they say, oh man, this is way not what you're supposed to do, then, you take their advice, whatever comments they give you, and incorporate those before the project deadline. But if they're like, oh man, your reports are awesome. If you do all 3 reports before this checkpoint and the TA says your reports are awesome, guess what you're done with? Reports. You don't have to think about them at all. But the actual reports are due at the same time as the project. So they're not being graded until the project deadline. But don't miss that round of feedback. We give that feedback for reasons because these reports, it's even with me talking about it for a lecture and a half, it's probably still not 100% clear what I'm asking you to do, and that's fair. That's why we have the project report checkpoint, is to give you that round of feedback. And the TA who gives you the feedback for this checkpoint will be the same TA who grades your project at the end. So if there are any inconsistencies, which there might at least be minor ones, but there shouldn't be any major ones, but if there's minor inconsistencies between the grading of the TAs, what they're looking for in reports, you don't got to worry about it because it's going to be the same TA giving you your feedback at the checkpoint and who's going to be grading your final reports. So I tried to make this as fair as possible. I think that's pretty fair. But don't miss that checkpoint. Teams who miss that checkpoint, well, usually they end up with really bad reports too, but they didn't even get that round of feedback to give themselves a chance. That usually ends up bad. And like I said, I do not like having a project that works, the code's great and everything, and I have to give them a bad grade because of reports. But usually those are the teams who just don't take the reports seriously at all. If you're taking the reports, if you're even thinking about reports at this point in time, you're going to be fine. You're going to do what you need to do and get it done. But there are teams who rush at the last minute to get the code done and then don't leave any time for reports. They start thinking of reports on December 9th at 11 p.m. Those are the teams that, even if their code works, they're screwed. But any questions in here that... Nicholas, any questions in chat that I don't want to just sit here and stare at my phone for a minute? Okay, cool. All right. Any questions about reports at all? Because I'm moving on. Cool. I might not talk about reports again at all in lecture, if there are no questions. Of course, you can ask questions about reports later, and then I'll talk about it, but by default, I'm not going to allocate any more time. Okay, let's talk about this. Yes? The rubric for the presentation, you have the... So this is, I don't have oh yeah, if you just missed this link, then yeah, that's your answer, the link on here. But here are the requirements. I don't have a rubric per se, a chart with here's a 1, 2, and 3. I don't have that, but there are 3 sections to the presentation. Demo your project, talk about the architecture of your project, and then some reflection. What advice would you give yourself if you could go back in time to the beginning of the semester? As long as you have those 3 parts, I'm pretty soft on the presentation grading. But make sure you have those 3 parts. Like I'll have teams that, I grade these equally, so I'll have teams that just don't do the reflection part. And usually I ask them, like, what about your reflection to give them a chance? But if they just completely skip a section, like that's a 66, that's 2/3. So just make sure you have all 3 parts and don't completely half-ass it and you'll be good. Okay, so let's talk about streaming. This is one of the only things I gave an open invitation to request anything. Streaming and browsers were the 2 things that were said. So let's talk about streaming. Hopefully I can fill up the rest of the time with streaming so I don't have to talk about browsers. I don't know. Or should I just talk about browsers quickly now and then spend the rest of the time? I don't know. I don't want to talk about browsers. But anyway, here's video streaming. So I have some kind of partial demo set up. I don't have, I didn't rebuild Twitch or anything. But I'll talk about the architecture of how Twitch and YouTube work. We'll go to those sites and everything, and I'll just kind of share what I know about video streaming. So to get a video playing in your browser with HTML5, which used to be new, it's not even that new anymore, but we just call it HTML now. It's so old. But with HTML5, it's super easy. You have a video element. You give it some attributes to control it a bit. I'm saying controls, that means display some controls to the user. Don't just play this video and not give them any control. Autoplay it when the page loads and play it muted. If you don't mute the video, I'm pretty sure this is still the case. If you don't mute the video, you're not allowed to autoplay it, which as a user of the internet, I'm grateful for. But of course, developers get around that anyway. So there's constantly websites I go to where it just starts yelling at me, and I hate it every time, unless that's what I'm there for. And then give it a source. I'm just going to give this an MP4 file, specify the type of the file, and that's it. That's it. We're going to open this in my browser, and it plays my video. This bottom one is the code that we just talked about. That's all I have to do. And then my server is hosting that MP4 file, which I'm not even hosting it. I just opened this without a server. So it just went to my file system and opened up that file, and everything was fine. And it plays the video for me. I can make it full screen because I have these controls. I can change the playback speed. And this is all through the default video player of my browser. So this will be a little bit different in each browser, but it'll be whatever the default video player is. Each browser has to implement HTML5 if they're going to call themselves a browser. And they give us a default player. So if I open this in I already said that. But if I open this in another browser, it might be a little bit different than what I see there. And that's, oops, wrong one. So that's pretty easy. You support videos on your website. I could change Homework 2 into a video uploading site as opposed to an image uploading site, and it's like almost no difference. Especially if I give you the front end code, it wouldn't be any difference in your code. Handling video is super trivial in HTML5. If we want to stream video, things get a little bit more complex. So that MP4 worked fine, but I had to send the entire, I get a request for the MP4, I send the entire MP4, and then the browser's pretty good. Browsers these days are pretty good about reading the first chunk while it's buffering, reading the first chunk of the MP4, playing the video, starting the video as it's still downloading. So you actually don't get much delay. The browser's pretty smart about these MP4s. But server side, if somebody wants to watch a few seconds of this video, I'm shipping that entire MP4. If that MP4 is a gigabyte, I got to send them a gigabyte for somebody to watch the first 2 seconds and say, I don't want to watch this, and then go navigate to another page. Not necessarily what we want. So what we use is streaming videos. I'm going to use a protocol called I put this in my minimal notes here because I knew I'd forget it. HLS, HTTP live streaming. For some reason that acronym just doesn't stick for me. HLS, which instead of putting the entire video as the source, I'm going to put this M3U8 file as the source, and then specify that this is going to be an XMPEG URL. This M3U8 file is going to have all the meta information for my video. And then my video itself is going to be split into many different files. So here's my actual raw video file. Of course, it's not ASCII, so it can't decode into text. It's just raw bytes in these .ts files. So I took this same video that we just saw, the space.mp4, and my UI is locking up because I opened a file with a bunch of crap. Oh, goodness. So the M3U8 file has all the meta information of which file names contain which segments of the video. And then when the video is playing, we're going to request the M3U8 file, and that's going to tell us when to download each file. So like we'll download the first one, and then as we're, whenever the browser decides. But as we're at the very latest getting close to the end of output 0.ts, we're going to request output 1.ts and keep getting the next video. If somebody skips to the middle of the video, we're going to go check what file that is and go right to like output 8 and request that file. So we took this MP4, this big file, and split it into smaller chunks so we just serve one piece of the file at a time. And my PyCharm is just eating up my resources. Hey, PyCharm, I'm kind of in the middle of something. If you could not do this. I can probably do the rest of this without PyCharm, just not as... just not the same. All right. I'm going to have to do the rest of this without PyCharm. And if we look in the Network tab, we can see this in action. So this top one... Actually, I can still talk about what I want to talk about right here. So one problem with this that's so complicated though. You go to Network. So one problem with this is the default video player in your browser won't necessarily, I'm not aware of a browser that does though, won't handle this HLS, this HTTP live streaming protocol. It won't handle it. So I actually have a library that I'm using, video.js. I'm importing that library and then creating a video.js player by setting the class of this video, the data setup, and then specifying my my video that I'm going to play by the M3U8 video file. So then when this video plays, you'll notice that it's a little bit different player because this is not my browser's default player. This is a library that's going to have a standardized player across all browsers. If I open this in any browser, this bottom one might change the way this is set up, but the top one is always going to be the same because I'm using a library for this. Like if you open up YouTube in any browser, it's always going to be the same player with the same controls and everything. If you use the default browser player, it's going to be different in each browser, potentially different. And if we look at our requests, we can see space.mp4. We had a request for that MP4. We got a response that's 88 megabytes for our content length, and we just shipped the whole thing. Now the browser is smart about how it's reading it. It's reading it in chunks and then playing it immediately, like I said. But our server is sending 88 megabytes immediately. Here's the entire file, ships the whole thing. As opposed to this HLS format, first we're making a request for the M3U8. That's the file that we specified in our video player. We get a response, 3K, of course, because it's just text. And that gives us all this meta information. Output 1.ts is this range of bytes. Output 0 is this range of bytes. And it specifies where we are in the video, and it should have some encoding information up here as well. So this is what this video is. And then when we get that M3U8, then we're going to make requests for each .ts file. We're making a request for output 0.ts, and we're going to get just part of the video. Just part of the video, and we actually have, don't ask me to explain this one, I don't know 100% how this one's working, but we're requesting in parts of the TS files, that there are 3 requests. I didn't do anything to respond with this 206. So I don't know where that is, if the browser's doing that or if something else is doing this. And then output 1, we got the entire thing. We didn't just got 200 OK instead of a partial response. And we got all 1 megabyte of the video file there. So just 1 megabyte at a time instead of 80 at a time. Looks like our encoding's a little, oh no, this one's, half a 0.6 megs. Our encoding is different, so the file size won't add up. The sum of these won't be the total of the size of the MP4 because it's a different encoding. But then we keep making requests and get the video in chunks. That's the key part that we want here. The video is delivered in small sections to be able to get this entire video. Let's see if PyCharm calmed down. So what you need to do if you're making a video server and you want to host files with this HTTP live streaming, let me get away from that file quickly because I think that's the one that messed me up. So when we get a request for this, and that's not what I was saying. So what we need to do is take our video file and convert it to HTTP live streaming. Because most videos that you have, you record them with your phone or you download or whatever, or you have on a DVD. Nobody uses DVDs anymore, do they? I'm dating myself on that one. But they're not going to be in HTTP live streaming format. So we need to re-encode these videos into a different format that whatever source video we have, we can convert it into this HTTP live streaming. For that, the library for this is FFmpeg. This is the library for video processing. It's an open source library, has tons of contributors, tons of work went into this. And whenever I look into any video processing anything, it seems like somewhere under the hood, it's using this library. It just seems to be the most ubiquitous library that's actually doing video encoding, transcoding, anything that we need video to do with videos. So here's an example of this. This library is just a wrapper library. So if I go into the code of this library, let me go into my method call actually. Run. If we go into this library, we'll see that we're actually going to get see if I can get to this point. Get to the code that looks like something you might have seen. popen. This is something you might have seen if you ever made a system call from Python. You've probably ran into this, is probably what you used. We're actually making system calls to the FFmpeg library. So this is just a wrapper class that's letting us use Python code to make system calls by making calls to Python methods. So instead of just calling FFmpeg itself directly through our own system calls, all the library is doing is giving us a nice interface to be able to make those system calls. What this means is you don't only have to install this library, but you actually have to have FFmpeg installed on your machine. So if you don't have FFmpeg installed, this library won't work. So if you do want to play around with this, make sure you install FFmpeg, or else you're just going to get errors when you run this. Because all you're doing is making system calls to the library, to the actual library. But the library is not written in Python. It's almost certainly written in C. It might be in C++, but it's not written in Python. So we can't interact with it directly. We've got to use some system calls. So this library here is going to give us some easy ways to be able to work with that. I'm going to run this as I talk about it because it takes a while to process this video. We get all kinds of output here. And what I want to do here is take my input MP4, and I'm just going to flip it and save the new file as output.mp4, and I should have the same video but reversed. It takes a bit, but once this says that it's done, let me set up my HTML right away. This is going to be output.mp4, which doesn't exist yet. But once this is done, I'll have output.mp4, which will be the same as the input video, but reversed horizontally. And there's obviously all kinds of stuff that you can do. I'm just doing one thing, for example. But anything you want to do to manipulate a video, this library can do it. It's a bit like using Photoshop as opposed to MS Paint. Like, it's got a lot of power, but it can be tricky to use. I got my output.mp4. Let me go over here, resize this, refresh, and we would expect the bottom video to be reversed. And there it is. I just reversed that video using this FFmpeg library. So the same library can be used, and I did use it not through Python code, which is why I don't have any Python example, but I went to the command line and just typed in my FFmpeg commands directly to be able to convert this. I opened that file again. To be able to convert that space video into this HLS format. So we have this FFmpeg library. We get our video in some format, what I usually refer to as raw format, and then we're going to process it into this HLS format. That's what we need to do when we're, I can't believe I did this again. I locked it up again. But that's what we need to do when we're, shouldn't say that's what we need to do, but that's how live streaming works. We get some raw input from the user. We're going to re-encode that into HLS or some other format that's going to do the same thing for us, and then host that HLS format where we have files going out in chunks. And this way, I gave the one benefit of we don't send the entire raw video at one time. Like, that's one benefit of HLS. But when you're streaming content, you need something like HLS because you can't send the whole video. The streamer's still recording it. You can't just send the entire video that's still being recorded. That doesn't make sense. So what you do is get the raw video, encode a chunk of it, put that in your, host that on your content server, and then get the next chunk, host that, next chunk, host that, and then every so often you're going to generate a new M3 U8 file to store the meta information for that next chunk of video, and then return more meta files to be able to get the user the information, and then keep making requests to the new content. Yeah. I forget off the top of my head, but actually let's just. Yeah, get off of my screen. Where's the X? But something like that. But that's all I did to convert that video. I just did some searches, found a command like this, swapped the parameters out to meet my needs, and just ran it. So let's see this in action. We're going to have some risky clicks here. Oh goodness! Every time. Let's do Call of Duty. Like I get that Amaranth exists, but why does Twitch have to push her so much? And why is my, it's like, why is my ad blocker not running? It's because I'm in Chrome. I didn't install an ad blocker in Chrome because I use Opera on this machine. But once this ad is done, there we go. So we got a stream running. Let me refresh to make sure. And somewhere in here, if I can find it, let's check this guy. It's a TS file, so we already got the meta information at that point. CSS, GQL. How did we go right to a TS? U1 Twitch chat. This will be these are going to be our WebSockets for Twitch chat. Somewhere in here is going to be the good stuff. There we go. So here's an M3U8 file, which for some reason we can't preview. Well, just show me the damn file. But that's going to be our meta information, and once we get that file, that's telling our browser which TS files to request. And of course, they're huge randomly generated IDs for these things. But that's going to tell us which TS files to request, and then if we scroll down, we should see all of our video being streamed in as individual TS files. And every once in a while, I got it on the first try there, every once in a while we're going to get a new M3U8 to give us the new meta information for the next chunk of videos that we're going to request, the next TSs. So as Twitch is getting in this, this stream, it's processing the data in chunks for each M3U8, and then each chunk is being divided into smaller chunks for the TS files, and that's how we're getting our stream, by constantly requesting new TS files to get our new information rendered to the player. So most of these should be TS files. I just got lucky that the first one was a meta file. Oh, the second one's a meta file too. Maybe we're getting a lot more than I thought from Twitch. Yeah, quite a few M3 U8s. So that's how it's working. It's transcoding into HLS, and then we're requesting those TS files constantly to get a simulation of one smooth stream experience as we're watching. I'm not going to have time to jump over to YouTube. I was gonna. YouTube uses a different format because they're Google. Google seemingly has their own format for everything. They're big enough that if they can squeeze a little bit of optimization out of the way they stream video, they're going to do it. And that's, the size of YouTube, they're going to save a lot. So they actually use a different protocol that works the same way, same concept, but it's not going to look the same exact way. I don't have time to show that off. And my next note, because I'm going to forget the acronym, I always forget this acronym, but they don't ingest MP4s like we saw. Twitch, any streaming service, Twitch, YouTube Live, any streaming service, they're going to ingest RTMP video as a format. What this protocol does effectively, it's kind of like WebSockets in a way, where it's going to take a TCP stream and just send video data over it, just constantly streaming video data on an open connection, an open TCP connection that just stays connected and continuously streams video the whole time. So you're just getting raw video input. This is when you, if you've ever done streaming, if you download OBS and run OBS and put in the server, the ingest server, it's going to send RTMP video to the ingest server. The ingest server is going to convert into, for Twitch's case, HLS format, and then host that HLS format for the user. So it's processing your video and then hosting it for the users. Fun fact with this, streaming, whether you're streaming or whether you're watching a live stream or watching a VOD of a live stream, It's actually the same data that you're requesting. The HLS works the same way whether you're getting it live or watching it after the fact. It doesn't really matter to the protocol. You're just getting different files. You're requesting different files at different times. If you're live streaming, you just happen to be requesting the latest files that are ready for consumption. So streaming services usually have a VOD option. It's just automatic for them. They're already doing all the work. Hosting the VODs is nothing, no extra work. The only concern is storage. That's why Twitch will delete older videos if you don't manually save them, just because of storage. And I got through everything I wanted to talk about with streaming. That's video streaming. Any questions on this? Okay. Have a great weekend. If I don't see you at the hackathon, I'll see you Monday.